Nellie Bowles is a former New York Times reporter who is a founder of the Free Press. Her new book is Morning After the Revolution, Dispatches from the Wrong Side of History. I'm so excited to have you as my guest. This book, Morning After the Revolution, I got to read a preview copy. I loved it so much. And it is sort of like, I feel every once in a while, Nellie, you get the right book at the right time. And you hit a news cycle with a book coming out that is making your points.
I think what we're seeing on campus is definitely...
Tell me about that. So when you look at college campuses and you think about writing this book, and the book takes a long time to write, but it comes out and you're like, this is my point.
Well, in the protests around 2020, 2021, it was very important to downplay the role of Antifa and the role of violence and that kind of tension that there might be violence. And I think now we're seeing the reveal of violence might be part of the conversation in an open way. When you're hearing chants of there's only one solution, intifada revolution, that's a call for violence. These aren't anti-war protests that are happening on campus. They're pro-war protests, which you can be pro-war. I mean, I'm pro all sorts of wars. And so, but I think that the last few years have been a kind of build-up in terms of opening the American conversation and the mainstream liberal conversation outside of the confines that we used to think of. It's not the hippie movement anymore. Now it's a movement that's very comfortable with violence. And I think a lot of that started in 2020.
At Columbia University, you had janitors who were held against their will. And one of your reporters at the Free Press, Francesca Block,
an amazing reporter.
She tracked them down and she was talking to them about what it was like. And I wonder, from your viewpoint as a nurturing younger reporters, in this moment that they're watching, how do you mentor them and make sure that they're figuring out, like, this is a gigantic story? That she got that story was a big deal, but it also really said, we are at a turning point where you have people who aren't even members of a university who are holding custodians hostage.
I think it's just to let reporters' natural curiosity flourish. It's the mainstream media now kind of forces young reporters, any reporter, but a lot of young reporters, into kind of a lockstep, what's good for the moment, what's good for the revolution, what's good for the party. And if you just let someone's natural curiosity blossom, I mean, the fact that a janitor was held hostage within the building is inherently interesting. It's crazy. It's hilarious in a lot of ways. I mean, it's dark. It's all of the things. It's a story. It's a great story. And I think one thing we want to do with the Free Press is let people be curious. Let people be open-minded and see what's happening and follow that.
You write a column called TGIF, which is hysterical and awesome and so right on point. And you think about Jerry Seinfeld. That's a big get for any university to get for their commencement speaker. And I think, to be fair, there weren't that many people who walked out.
Yeah, it's like 30 kids.
Okay.
But still, it's an unpleasant scene.
But then you go and you look at, like, University of Berkeley. Berkeley University's graduation, we had a young woman on America's Newsroom crying because she said, I worked so hard and I can't hear any of the commencement speakers because of the chanting that is pro-Hamas.
Yeah. Well, I think the Jerry Seinfeld walkout was especially perfect because a lot of what this movement doesn't like is humor, right? They don't want someone who's poking a little fun at anything about it. And Jerry Seinfeld is poking fun at a lot of things. And so, of course, they walked out on his speech. Of course. They could not. But yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing basically a small faction of students take over the conversation. They're taking over the campus. They're taking over the conversation, and it's making it so schools are scared to hold graduation ceremonies at all. This is a group of students who started in the middle of the pandemic when their freshman year was online, and now their graduations are moving online. I mean,
you used to be at the New York Times, and since then you've become a mom, and you're about to be a mom of another little one that's coming this summer, coming attraction. And when you think about institutions and the media, and especially anti-Semitism in this moment, one of the things you do in TGIF is just point out the headlines or the points that they make. And it really is sort of stunning. Dan Senor, who's a crowd favorite here at the Fox News Rundown, he says if you put into any sort of search engine anti-Semitism and pick a century, that you'll be surprised at how much it is perpetuated from the universities.
Yeah.
What should we know about that?
I mean, it's counterintuitive, right?
Yes.
Because these are smart people. These are rich people. It's like the people in America's elite institutions, it doesn't make sense why they would be so prone to anti-Semitism. And honestly, my wife is the expert on this. She's very wise, who is the author of How to Fight Anti-Semitism. And so I'm channeling her as I'm trying to answer this. I think that within the DEI intersectional worldview that has kind of taken over our elite spaces, and that is the operating mode for America's universities, Jewish issues, anti-Semitism, it's almost seen as punching up. It's almost seen as fighting white supremacy. It sounds so dark to say it, but I think very clever people who I'm not going to answer this that well. I'm
okay.
sorry.
It's all right. No, it's okay. But let me ask you it this way. Because
Yeah.
I remember in
Bear can
TGIF
do the perfect version
talking
of this.
about Sheryl Sandberg, who has just recently put out a documentary about the sexual assaults against people in Israel on October 7th. And one of the things I remember you writing about was about the United Nations Women's Organization taking its sweet time to point this out.
It's within this worldview, Jews are seen as the ultimate white person, the ultimate powerful person, the kind of person who is the most exempt from any of the progressive stack, right? Which is the way of ranking where the least privileged person speaks first, and then the second least privileged person speaks after that, which it's always confusing to figure out, like, how do a gay and Asian, which one goes first? But anyways, the Jewish person is considered the most privileged person, the most white person. And so there's a real comfort with anti-Semitism within these conversations and the academic world, within elite America right now.
If you are giving people a little bit of, maybe on a hopeful note, about institutions and maybe journalism, media, what is it?
I think that there's a reform movement brewing. I think that with the emergence of stuff like the Free Press and things that are pressuring from the outside, that there is a movement within these mainstream institutions like the Times, even I would argue potentially NPR, which dare to dream maybe, but I think there's a reform movement to say enough is enough, and for leadership to try to clamp down. I don't know if it will work, but you're seeing inklings of it. Joe Kahn, the editor of the New York Times, recently said that he wants to make it clear that the New York Times is not here just to get Biden reelected, which the fact that he needed to say that, we can have a longer conversation. But I think you're seeing a reform movement starting to brew within these places, in part because it is just incredibly dull to have to ignore the most interesting stories that are happening in the world right now. It's incredibly dull to have to pretend like the campus protests are peace and love protests versus pro-war. To have to pretend all this stuff, it's hard and it's dull.
I thought about that too, like with the border. I'm thinking, why is it that Bill Maloogian is the only reporter down at the border? Like, this is a story that anybody would want to cover.
It's an amazing story, and you have to work really hard to squelch that curiosity. And so I'm being maybe naive, but I still think that there is a movement brewing to fight some of that lockstep insanity that you see in the mainstream.
Well, let's move to that larger conversation, because I love the book. Again, it's Morning After the Revolution, Dispatches from the Wrong Side of History. I love the anecdote of you practicing announcing yourself as Nellie Bowles of the New York Times. Tell me about what it was like to get a job at the New York Times, which you probably had dreamed about.
Well, I grew up in San Francisco, was always a very good progressive, but also just very good at prestige, very good at like getting the right award, doing the right thing, getting the good grade. And for me, joining the Times was the only dream. It was the only, it was supposed to be the job for life for me. And I was such a nerd about it. I was really a nerd. I would look in the mirror and I would say, Nellie Bowles, New York Times. And I think I really believed in all of the rhetoric. And I think that what we're seeing in a lot of our sort of large old American institutions is a lot of the rhetoric is really beautiful. But it's not the reality of what is fueling these places and the values that are within these places. And so once I got into the building, it went very well for a few years. And then as soon as you saw sort of 2019 through 2021, as soon as you saw some of the things that weren't maybe convenient for a narrative that the paper wanted to push at the time, you saw a real clampdown. And at some places...
Clampdown by the editors?
Clampdown mostly by colleagues and kind of a social, kind of like the social climate became... You'd be more or less smeared if you started reporting things that the rank and file didn't like. And you saw, I mean, this is kind of neither here nor there, but you saw with Donald McNeil, like it eventually reaches the newsroom leadership.
Tell people about that story. That was he took some kids on a field trip.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, it's such a long, convoluted story, but basically this longtime Timesman, the newsroom. Do you want to hear the whole story? Should I
want to hear
actually
do
it?
We have time because
we
have time.
This longtime Timesman who years and years ago had been on a field trip with some teenagers when the Times was doing this thing to make some extra cash. And one of the kids had asked him about what he thought about another kid saying the N-word in the context of video. And he said, well, explain to me the broader context. And he repeated the N-word, the whole word, in asking the question. Okay. He was then punished at the time, kind of quietly, and everyone moves on for years. And that probably was the totally appropriate thing. Then, years and years later, he's the lead reporter on COVID. And for reasons you might guess, he upset the broader movement within the paper. They didn't like that he was the lead reporter on COVID. And so what did they do? But they dredged back up that old incident, that really ridiculous, silly thing that he was absurdly punished for in the first place. But whatever, they dredged it up and they used it to drum him out of the paper. And eventually, the rank and file colleagues can get you pushed out. And so I'm there. I'm starting to get some sense of this. And I'm like, I got to get out before they manage to smear me with something like this.
Maybe tell people a couple of things about what it was like. I wrote here that it was shocking to think of how you were edited. I mean, you were an amazing writer, and if anybody listening wants to be a better writer, my advice is to read good writing, and you should read Nellie Bowles. And one of the things that they would tell you in sending back stories to you is you get with the program, Nellie.
Yeah, so this started happening. It started amping up in 2020 and 2021, which was basically there was a disinformation movement within the paper, and there was a freelance editor who was kind of the disinformation consultant. There was a Slack channel, and the idea was this group would come and help review anything that might be disinformation. Now, we all kind of know at this point how that term is used. When Biden tried to have a disinformation office within the government, it was in the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, it's used as a tool of censorship, and it's used in the most disingenuous way you can imagine. So at the time, I was doing a story about PragerU, which I'm sure listeners know is a conservative video maker, but pretty standard conservative, not particularly radical. I don't watch all their videos. Maybe there's some radical, but from my take, it was pretty normal. And I was doing a story about how they were going on campus and doing these really funny viral videos that were causing a huge stir. Good story. And the disinformation consultant kept coming back to me saying, you need to add more about the disinformation angle. And I kept being like, well, what part is the disinfo? Like, they're pro-life. Maybe you and I might be pro-choice, but it's not disinformation to be pro-life. It's not false. And he was like, you really need to add more about the disinformation. There's a lot of disinformation there. And it drove me crazy. But at the time, I also was desperate to be in the good. I was desperate to stay in the only job I thought I'd ever have. And so I, of course, complied after pushing back, a little bit on some emails. And then what do? I call up a Berkeley professor who I know is going to give me some quote. And I quote the Southern Poverty Law Center, who the disinformation expert had told me to quote. And the Southern Poverty Law Center basically argues, PragerU is dangerous disinformation because if you watch a lot of those videos, you might later be recommended videos that are further to the right and that are probably pretty sick or something, who knows? And I was like, I have to add in that it's disinformation because YouTube might later recommend you more things that could be disinformation. Anyways, I did it. I put it in because I wanted a byline.
How'd that make you feel?
A little dirty.
Yeah.
Not great. But I couldn't see outside the world of prestige media at the time. It was the only thing that was on the horizon in my mind. And so I put it in. I got on the front page, and I was very pleased with myself after that. And I was sort of like, okay, fine, I did it. And eventually, though,
it kept happening, though, because, for example, you wanted to go and you wanted to see things, and on defund the police in particular. And you write in the book, there's a couple times when you're walking down the street with some protesters and you're thinking, well, this is not good, guys. But still, the editor said, you need to get with the program. You're on the wrong side of history.
Covering the defund and abolish the police movements definitely was considered completely inappropriate within the context of the times at the time. I mean, one thing that a lot of the mainstream media does is this thing that I'm trying to make this phrase a thing, but it's not a thing. But I call it time laundering, where they basically take a story, like, let's say defund the police. Let's say gender dysphoric teens and medical transition. They wait until the conservative press or the sort of Substackerati, the independent press, has covered it for approximately 2 years, and then the mainstream can touch it. And then the mainstream is allowed to report on it. And so for defund the police, I was trying to report on it when it was happening. And I was like, guys, there's great stories here. There's businesses that are suing cities. There's Black communities that don't want the police defunded. Like, these are amazing features. And I was a features reporter. And the idea is basically, no, don't touch that. Ignore anything that is not convenient to the moment. And now, years later, you see each of these topics slowly be touched. I mean, now with the pediatric gender transition stories, you're seeing an explosion in the mainstream press, right? This is something that the rest of us have been talking about for 3 years.
It drives Greg Gutfeld crazy because he'll say, we've been talking about this for 3 years on the 5, and we consider Fox the early warning system. But he said, but it's like they have blinders. Like, if Fox says it, then they absolutely can't report it.
You can't report it. You have to wait 2 years. You have to time launder it. You gotta let it air out.
He said, like, if Biden had just listened to us 2 years ago, he would know that inflation was going to do this.
Exactly. I know, the crime wave, all of it. It's like clockwork. And that's very boring if you're a reporter and you're wanting to write about the world. I mean, it takes a lot to like we said about the Columbia janitor. It takes a lot to squelch curiosity.
There was a story that you went to, let me see if I can find it now, where you go to CHAZ.
Oh, yeah.
CHAZ was
CHAZ.
We loved CHAZ. And you know what? So, okay, just for listeners, CHAZ was in Seattle, and it was where they decided to basically do Lord of the Flies. And there was going to be an area where there was no police, and everybody was going to get along. I mean, it really was a Lord of the Flies experiment. You look back and think, what were they thinking? And you go to Seattle and Capitol Hill, I can't remember what that was called. Autonomous Zone. That's right. And you talk to a guy named Fazil Khan.
Yeah.
And he's a barista owner in Seattle.
Yeah.
And he's like, I don't think this is such a good idea. And I wonder, I would love to talk to him now, like what he thinks. But the desperation for some of the people who are like, I love my community, I want to live here, but I don't think I'm going to be safe here, and I can't live here anymore.
Well, in Seattle, a group of anti-fascists, Antifa, who have been really beautifully written about by Andy Ngo, of course, but they took over a number of city blocks, specifically in the gay neighborhood. And they took it over. They put up barricades, and they declared it an autonomous zone. And what that meant was no police, no ambulances. It meant very serious border control. I mean, that's these guys are really good at border control, actually. If you look at the campus protests today and look at what they put up in UCLA, I mean, they put up serious boundaries. You have to have a wristband to get into the protest areas. Anyways, so in CHAZ Chop, the reason it's two names is they renamed it at one point. But
yeah, they were having bad press, and so they called it Chop CHAZ. And at Fox, we usually have the location of whatever video you're looking at, in the top left corner, it will say like Seattle, Washington. But instead, they changed it to CHAZ, which I thought was just so funny and a great way to poke at them a little bit.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I mean, they took it over, and the mayor of Seattle went all in. The mayor of Seattle was like, "This is the summer of love. This is beautiful." She would show up at their daytime events,
and she wouldn't back up the black female police chief.
No, of course, and because of course it's internalized white supremacy. Skin color has nothing to do with anything. The neighborhood, of course, turned into an absolute chaos. I probably can't say shit show, but
you can say whatever you want.
It turned into absolute chaos, where you had a vacuum of power. And what fills in a vacuum? I mean, it was private security guards. It was sort of BLM guards who would walk around asking to be paid. It was Antifa members who didn't want to be paid so much as they wanted you to do loyalty pledges. They would wander over to different restaurants and make the staff all do a loyalty pledge. And at night, you would see videos that were coming out. I mean, I was watching this from afar at first. And at night, you would see videos coming out of shootings, of people passing around guns. And it was like, what's going on up there? I've got the mayor telling me it's the summer of love, but I'm seeing these shaky videos of people handing out long guns. And it was basically a media blackout for a while, other than to go up and say what a beautiful garden they have. And I think, I mean, now you're, of course, seeing these various small attempts on university campuses, these autonomous zones, that I'm sure are having little tiny Lord of the Flies moments within them. But how much harm can you do within the quad? But yeah, it was, for me, what was important about that for our moment now was, first of all, it was funny and showed a lot of the insanity, but also that it showed the alliance between anti-fascists, the sort of movement that says violence is okay, with Black Lives Matter, a movement that was for, social revolution. And you saw that connection that I think we still see now with the pro-Hamas protests on campus.
Mm-hmm. There is a connection there.
Yeah.
You went to a seminar, and I think a lot of our listeners will hear this and say, gosh, I worry about this, or I know somebody who has been accused of being a racist, or I'm afraid my children are going to be called racist. And the chapter is called What I Heard You Say Was Racist. And I want to just read this one part. This one sentence. You said, "There is no escape. If you feel uncomfortable or claustrophobic, that's good. I felt claustrophobic within myself for days after." Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So one thing that's happened over the last few years is the rise of the therapeutic model of anti-racism. Whereas years ago, anti-racist activity might have been around changing laws or about changing things for the better in a developing nation. Now, anti-racism has become about changing yourself. It's an internal process. It's sort of a self-flagellation process. And this has been very effective for the movement in terms of it's very popular. And the women, largely white women, who pioneered this thinking around it have been very successful in this. So I went to one of these new anti-racist courses, and it's all about breaking down your internal whiteness and your internal white supremacy. And it was around 4 days, and I then, of course, signed up for the extra credit class. And you...
Are you a firstborn girl?
I have an older brother, but I'm the
I know, I'm the same.
Girl.
I'm like, okay, we're both going for the gold star on the chart on the refrigerator.
I'm going to be the best white woman anti-racist I can possibly be.
Okay.
And the course involved basically a psychological breakdown. It's almost like, I don't want to say, it's too easy to say it's like joining a cult or it's cult-like, but it involves some of that ego breakdown where you repeat over and over how racist you are inside, how you can never escape that. And in this worldview, there is no escape. And there is no escape from your whiteness, from the harm that your whiteness does. And it's a very circular, you feel trapped when you're doing it for a little while. And I think
Is that why you said I felt claustrophobic within myself for days after?
And I think all of us I mean, anyone in a big company in America today has been asked to take anti-racist courses, has been asked to basically engage with the therapeutic model of anti-racism. And it has nothing to do with making things better for a person of color. It has nothing to do with making a school that serves poor Black kids a better school. It has everything to do with your own mind. And that's why a lot of it is so, I mean, it's ripe for writing, but it's also so disturbing when you really get into it.
This is one of the reasons I love the book, and I think it's a great book for all sorts of different people to read, because we're all sort of feeling these things, but not exactly sure how to think about them. And you put it all down for us. And you don't tell people how to think. You're just reporting. And you're telling people, there was this one thing, it kind of made me laugh. This woman, Sarah, she said, in order to break down her ego, she had thin privilege. And I'm like, that's the worst kind. I'm like, how dare you?
Everyone has to confess their privileges. Everyone has to go. And
so like, it was even like a humble brag.
But the thing is, without religion, I mean, this is an argument that's been made by a lot of people, but without religion, people need something to fill that hole. People like saying sorry. They like feeling bad about things. And so this fills that hole. It allows for confession. It allows for apology. It allows for us to say, we're not perfect. And that's part of human nature, is wanting that. And so when you see organized religion kind of fall away, you see new organized religions come up.
Yeah. You also write about your home. Los Angeles is where you are, right?
Yes.
Say specifically where.
I grew up in San Francisco, long time lived there, and then now recently moved to LA.
And you write about this encampment where there were all of these people sort of playing activist, a little tent city.
Well, the American West has been in this absolute. Let me restart. Anyone who's been to the American West in the last 5 years has seen these tent cities. It's really hard to miss. It's in every town. It's in
I'm from
Seattle.
Colorado, and you see them in Denver for sure. Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them, first of all, there's a total denial that any of this has to do with mental illness or with fentanyl. It's all just like, this is capitalism at work. This is choice. This is people suffering.
It's like the romanticization of nomad.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. And there's this idea that they're making a sort of political choice, or that they're suffering under capitalism, not what's obviously happening, which is they're suffering under fentanyl. But so there was one in LA for a long time that blossomed into a little village, that basically a tent village that took over a city park. And this is what, again, is happening all across the West. They take over a city park and pretend like there's no loss from that. Like the community didn't need that park anyway. And if the neighbors fight for the park, they're called, what else? White supremacists. Even if, as with the one in LA, it's in a Mexican neighborhood. And it's in a neighborhood that is gentrifying but isn't particularly rich, and where people really use that park. They have quinceañeras in that park. They have wedding photo shoots in that park. And it was taken over by the fentanyl addicts, who are your typical residents there, but also a group of leftist activists who decided to make it a symbol of the need for revolution, the need to end capitalism. I mean, to use these people basically, and to anytime city workers would come in and say, guys, come to a shelter, come, let's like, get you somewhere more permanent or safer. The activists interrupt that. They don't want that. They want the encampments. I mean, this sounds crazy to say. It sounds beyond belief, but they don't, they argue that the shelters are carceral solutions because you have a check-in at 9 p.m. or whatever. You have rules of the shelters. You can't use drugs in the shelter. And so they try to block that. And they kept this park as kind of a homeless tent city paradise, homeless and DSA members. And it became embraced by especially the elite New York media, really took to it as a symbol. And when the cops eventually did clear it after shootings and
the killing of a baby duck,
multiple deaths, and a young woman, a beautiful young woman who arrived as an activist and was basically within a day or two found dead. The police eventually shut it down after that and took 2 bodies.
That's what it took.
Yeah. And when that was happening, the most surreal part, again, a park in a Mexican neighborhood that the local community has been desperately trying to clear out. The most surreal part was the New York media posting, calling it white supremacy to clear the park, posting, grieving the clearing of this park. And it was just so surreal to watch that.
It had to have been.
And it's like, you wouldn't see that in Central Park. You can't set up tents in Central Park. Nope. It wouldn't happen. Nope. But somehow the American West is supposed to hold all of this, and it's supposed to be the vision of progressive perfection.
You write a love letter, but a breakup letter with the city that you grew up in a chapter called The Failure of San Francisco. And I will tell you, I loved that city. I used to live in San Diego with my husband for 3 years. I worked on like PR internet type clients during the big boom of the internet, right? So I was in San Francisco a lot, and I loved that city. We loved going there. Yeah. It was romantic and fabulous and independent and great and so gorgeous, and I miss it very much. And I know that you do too. You also write about a woman named Jackie Berlin who is looking through some Facebook photos of all of these BART rants and raves, it's called, and complaints about the regional transportation system. And she says, hey, that's my son. And you write, his name is Corey Sylvester, and he's 31 years old. She posted a photo of him when he was sober. May he return there soon. You said she has 5 children. And since she posted that comment, she's become an activist, and she's trying to get the city to turn around.
She basically
Can the city turn around?
Yeah, I think it can. Well, she saw a photo posted in this forum kind of mocking this man who was clearly on drugs and passed out and looking like a mess on BART. And people were like, this is insane. This is so crazy. And she said that's my son. Mm-hmm. And I think that the fetishization of decay that we see in left-wing spaces right now, where the tent cities are fetishized, you also see on the streets the fentanyl problem in San Francisco is fetishized in this freaky way. Mm-hmm. And the people who are leading the battle to say, this isn't right, don't use my son as a political prop for your sort of libertarian / socialist bizarre freedom vision. These people need help. It's the moms. It's all the moms. The moms of these people have gathered. They're now a political force in San Francisco. They hold rallies, and they say, get our kids. The only time their kids are themselves again is, unfortunately, when they're arrested.
And they're in jail. Yeah, jail has become the place.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Because we refuse, because driven by a very beautiful vision of human nature and driven by empathy, you have cities that have refused to do the hard thing. Yeah. Which is to take someone who's on the streets and say, we have to get this person help. And we might have to force them.
So one of the things you're doing at the Free Press is having some events. Oh, yeah. And debates. And one is coming up about San Francisco.
Yes, and about crime in San Francisco. I mean, this is a city that had a district attorney who said we shouldn't prosecute crime. We shouldn't prosecute drug dealers. This is a city that has been really at the center of the progressive prosecution movement. And it also is a city that has seen a reform movement. This is why I'm long on San Francisco. I think it's going to find its way. First of all, it's the most beautiful land, and it can't be ceded. We can't abandon it. It's too pretty.
I agree. I love it so much.
It's too nice. I refuse. But we're going to have a debate about crime in San Francisco, where it is the number one issue on a lot of voters' minds and a lot of San Franciscans. And it's really a debate between liberals and leftists within the city. No one wants extreme policing policies. We're talking about people wanting some policing and some laws versus people who want, I mean, I'm obviously biased here because I'm on I like the sort of more moderate argument, but people who want a little more order and people who think that the progressive movement just didn't do it right.
Lord of the Flies is a classic for a reason. Like, it doesn't work, so I don't know why they keep trying it. Just a couple more questions here. Actually, let me just read this one part, or talk about this one part for a moment, because I think it sort of sums up where you talk about. It's on page 235. Let me just go to this page. It's called "The Joy of Canceling," and you were getting pressure to cancel somebody and you didn't want to do it. And that you're talking about that societal pressure from either colleagues or friends or something like, are you part of this movement or not? Are you going to help us, cancel him? And you decide not to say anything. And a friend of yours says, basically,
she ends a friendship.
She said, you write, she very politely told me that I was a racist. And then she said goodbye. Later on in the book, you said, I never heard from her again. There's a part of me that admires her for it.
Yeah. I think when I think about the movement, I think about the idealism of it. And we lose that when we're just outside criticizing it or saying everyone should be a moderate or whatever. There's a beauty to the idealism. And I'd be foolish to deny that. And it's purity politics, but it comes from a place, a belief in human purity, which is kind of stunning. And so, yeah, the friendship ended. I didn't cancel this young man who I was supposed to cancel that day. Mind you, I had canceled people prior to this. So I'd been a good soldier. And I think even as I now am outside of the movement and I'm outside of a lot of these purity politics, now I'm just bad. You can't help but admire the intensity of belief and commitment to it in a way. I don't know. Does that make me sick?
No, I think that one of those things is like you wrote this book like, am I crazy? Or actually, no, I'm not crazy. You write also, you talk about who's reading the book, and you said it could be someone like myself, someone who now feels a little tribeless, a person of curiosity, someone whose politics are more exhaustion than doctrine. And I read that because it's a beautiful freaking sentence. I love it so much. Best advice you ever got?
Oh, best advice I ever got. My mom always told me the Flaubert quote. Is it Flaubert? Yeah. Which was to live your life like a bourgeois in a settled way so that your work can be wild. So basically have a boring life so you can be a little crazy with your work and have some fun. And I try to live that in that I live a boring life.
Your life's not boring.
No, but day to day, we keep it structured.
I have a life too. I'm like, I do not want any drama in my life. Yeah. I have a wonderful husband. We've been married for 26 years. And, I go home at the end of the day.
Like a happy family. I don't want any
drama in my life. But I feel a little wild in my work sometimes. Although I think people listening to this would be like, neither of you are wild. You think you are.
We're like trapeze artists out here. Come on.
I love the book. It is... Morning After the Revolution, Dispatches from the Wrong Side of History. Nellie Bowles, you're an amazing writer. Sign up for the free press. It's a great way to spend money, and buy it for your children. They will thank you for it. And read TGIF. It is the best.
Definitely always read TGIF.
Yes. Thank you, Nellie.
Thank you so much for having me on.